much, Yvonne. Thanks, Hazel, for inviting me. Thank you for wanting me to join and talk to you about these issues. I'm afraid I'm probably going to speak for 15 minutes instead of 10. I tried to get it down shorter, but I couldn't figure out what to leave out. So I still plan to leave enough time for question and answers. Next slide, please. Okay.
Okay, next.
Yeah, there we go. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So I too wanted to acknowledge the original stewards of the land. I also want to bring my ancestors into the room and acknowledge those who were enslaved, those who toil without just compensation. I want to also have us acknowledge those fallen, killed by police brutality and other forms of anti-Blackness. And I stand on the shoulder of those who use solidarity, cooperative economics for liberation. Next slide. So co-ops exist in racist societies. We have to admit that. We can't ignore that. I think we like to think of ourselves in the co-op movement as being progressive and not, falling for all the same issues. But I think we have to face the hard reality that we can't disassociate the co-op movement ourselves as cooperators from the history of discrimination, exclusion, institutional racism. We're all products of it. We carry invisible baggage about it on all sides, and we need to figure out ways to comfortably talk about it, acknowledge, and move past it. So I want to talk a little bit about the fact that structural and institutional racism have cumulative effects that are woven into the fabric of our societies, right? They manifest in our preferences, our attitudes, our psyches, our health, our economic relationships, as well as social and political relationships. So we have to understand that these racist, gendered societies that we live in have normalized these inequalities and normalized the stereotypes and allow us to continue to practice, subtle, invisible microaggressions and stereotypes, and that white privilege is considered the norm and so is often not seen. And so part of what I'm trying to talk to you today is about how to recognize the aspects of white privilege so that you can actually change behavior, change strategies, and do things that would be more than just having diversity and inclusion, because they're not enough. Next slide. So yeah, my title is that diversity and inclusion are not enough, because I actually have been losing patience when groups, especially progressive groups, feel like, okay, well, we have one person on the board and we invited 5 people to this meeting and we let all different Black, Indigenous, people of color into our co-op, so we're good, right? But it's not good enough, right? Being tolerant and sympathetic isn't enough. Being an ally isn't enough anymore. It's a start. So I'm not trying to say nothing is good, but we can't be complacent. We have to keep moving forward. That means we have to be very deliberate about how we practice racial equity. We have to resist the normality, and I'll talk more about what I mean by the normality and acceptance of presumed racial differences, right? We have to figure out how to resist those. And again, I'm hoping to end with strategies that might be helpful for how to move past and move forward and get further than just inclusion. And so that's why I say we have to be very proactive about recognizing and rooting out anti-Blackness and other forms of racism. Next slide. So let's talk a minute about diversity and inclusion, what they mean, and why I say they're not enough. So it's not good enough to be diverse. What's diverse? Diverse means, right, we have lots of representation from a variety of people with a variety of statuses, right? But then if you don't include them, if you don't give them meaningful participation, that's not enough. So what's inclusion, right? Inclusion is actually giving people a voice, an opportunity to participate, helping them to feel comfortable, being heard, hearing them, right? Giving them respect, right? My metaphor here is a dance, right? Or an event, a social event, right? Diversity is that you invite a bunch of different people to attend, right? But if most of the people of color or the people who are different are sitting on the sidelines and not being asked to dance or not feeling comfortable to dance or not dancing, then they're not included, right? You have diversity, but you don't really have inclusion. They're not really participating. They're not participating comfortably, equally, etc. But even if everybody gets to dance, right? What dances, what kind of music is there? What dances are they expected to do? Who decided on the music? Who decided on the food? Right? Are we expecting them to assimilate into what we want, the kind of food we like, the music we like, right? Or was there consultation? Was there leadership, diverse leadership in the decision making, right? Did we bring people in and ask their opinion, but then bully them or ignore them or marginalize them when they give their opinion or when they ask a question or something like that? Did we really give significant leadership, real influence in the decision making? What were the conditions and the norms under which they were included? That's sort of the overall question I'm asking, right? If it's just superficial inclusion, it's not enough. We haven't done enough. If we just have a couple of representatives of the group, one or two got invited on other people's terms, that's not really inclusion either. That's tokenism. And so you'll see a couple times in the slides, I have this notion of individualism and tokenism, right? Often we're just complacent that we've got one person representing all Blacks and another person representing all Asians or whatever, and that's diverse. And it's really not, that's tokenism. And it puts undue stress and strain on the people who are supposed to represent their entire group. And it doesn't, again, it's not real integration. It's not real, real equity. So I'm arguing that we need to unnormalize whiteness. We have to deliberately separate white, Western, middle-class assumptions from what we think or expect to be normal. It's just as insulting to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, for example, if you assume that they're poverty and deficits, that they have poverty and deficits, or, so it's just as insulting to assume they have poverty and deficits as it is insulting to ignore their particular circumstances and experiences, and to ignore the effects and impacts of institutional racism. Again, just, to say, okay, we've included them, but you haven't figured out whether they're being included on an equal basis, whether we're addressing some of the barriers and challenges that might reduce their effectiveness of participating or being part of the decision-making process. And we're also not doing anybody any favors if we make assumptions, because all people of color, all BI, POC, Black, Indigenous people of color are not the same, right? So we also can't lump everybody together and assume that anybody can represent specifically. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, of being aware of that and trying to break that sense of normality that we're stuck in, and break the tokenization. And then, you talked vaguely about language justice. I have to apologize too. I'm actually monolingual. I don't speak anything but English. I sort of understand a little bit of French and a little bit of Spanish. But we all really need to be multilingual as much as possible, because need for language justice is also an issue that can make real integration, real inclusion challenging, right? So we always have to have multiple language translations, multiple forms of communication, right? It's not just whether it's English or French or English or Spanish, but how we communicate, right? We need to communicate in multiple ways so that, again, everybody feels invited, feels heard, feels like there's genuine participation. So achieving this kind of what I'm calling racial equity, those things that I'm trying to talk about that we need to get to, I would count as racial equity. It's not easy since all aspects of life and society have to be addressed for it to be more than just tokenism, right? We've got to look at social relations, economics, power relations, efficiency assumptions, and we have to transform what we think of as normal in all those arenas. So are we willing to do that work? Are you willing? Next slide. First, we need to make sure we're recognizing the ways that our co-ops prejudice and perpetuate institutional racism. And we need to recognize how we might engage in racist microaggressions and exclusion, even if we're not aware of that. And we have to recognize, or you all have to recognize your own white privilege. I don't have it. And so how, again, how do we recognize it, and then what do we do about it? So the things that I see in the North American co-op movement, and actually the worker co-op movement is not always as bad as the broader co-op movement, but the worker co-op movement has a lot of work to do also. So first is the missing in action. And what I mean by that is when I started out in the co-op movement, I guess it's like 20 years ago now, maybe more, there weren't Black folks in the meetings and at the conferences. There weren't Black folks talked about in the materials, right? So we were missing in action, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. There was nothing about them at the meetings, in the discussions, in the materials. And then as I started becoming more and more involved, and I brought up the question, the fact that I was there made people say, oh yeah, well, we don't have a problem because you're here, right? And then for the US, we do have the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, and sometimes, especially if they met in the South, there were individuals from that organization who came. And so people told me it wasn't really a problem because, right, I was there, people felt comfortable, et cetera. But there was a problem because that was tokenism and invisibility. And it didn't really address what I was talking about. And so some of the things that I noticed that were keeping Black people from being involved were the conferences were too expensive. If Black people did go to some, they didn't feel heard or welcome. The focus was not on attracting Blacks or welcoming Blacks. They weren't turning people away, but they weren't doing anything to either do outreach or to make sure that the meetings covered issues that would have been of important or of interest to Blacks. Or you could, put Latinx, you could put Indigenous. But my experience was first focusing on the Black community. And then when I actually started getting some Blacks to attend some of these meetings, they would also complain the costs were too high, the issues weren't relevant, they felt alienated and lonely and tokenized, so many didn't come back. And then also some felt the invisible white privilege that other cooperators held and didn't feel comfortable in that sense. They didn't feel heard. They didn't feel like they had a real voice. They were just lurkers or visitors, right? They didn't really feel like they were real participants. And then the final issue is the materials. They didn't feel comfortable with the co-op development materials. There were no highlighting of the Black co-op movement. There was no talk of Black, Indigenous, people of color co-op leaders. There was no examples of Black, Indigenous, people of color co-ops. So the history was kind of whitewashed. There was no recognition of the role that co-ops have played, especially in North America, but also in Africa, South America, Caribbean, the role that co-ops have played in colonization, right? And helping settlers to displace other people and to lord it over other people. And so there was no honest discussion of the contradictions and tensions within co-ops. Right, there was this unnecessary, canonization of the Rochdale pioneers in 1844, as if nothing in economic cooperation happened or started anywhere else in the world, whereas we know that every population Every human population and every era of human history have used economic cooperation and cooperatives, and so no recognition of a broader notion of cooperation, just right a date, a Europeanized, westernized date. And so you can see how people would feel uncomfortable and not see, right, not see their own history, not see their own people in this movement and in these materials. Next slide. So that was just supposed to be cute. We could go to the next slide. So I wrote a book. One of the things I did to try to address this, because it made no sense to me that Black people should feel uncomfortable in the co-op movement. So I started researching, okay, if, you know, even I had not just white people, but Black people telling me that Blacks don't do co-ops and we're not in the co-op movement. And so that didn't sound right to me. So I started doing research. I ended up doing like 15 years of research before I actually published the book, Collective Courage. And what I found was just the opposite. African Americans, as well as Latinx and other indigenous peoples and other groups, have had long histories of using cooperative economics. We didn't always, right, there wasn't always laws to codify your co-op into an actual incorporated co-op business, but there are all kinds of co-op activity, mutual aid and cooperative and solidarity economic activity that has happened. And then as soon as the US had laws to codify cooperatives, African Americans started forming actual formal co-ops. So long history of that. Just this past year, a friend, colleague of mine actually started a study of Latinx co-ops in the US. So that's out now, and she's hoping to keep updating that. So we do have a better sense. We know we have some information now. So now that's not the excuse for not including this information. Again, now we have to get through that barrier of what's considered normal in the canon kind of thing. Next slide. I think I'm running out of time, so let's try to get to solutions. Oh, a couple more subtle issues to help us get to the right solutions. So the other things I want to just mention quickly are these assumptions about income and wealth and equity in a co-op, right? Cooperators are supposed to bring some kind of equity to a co-op, but often, and I think you guys in the worker co-op movement know this even better than we do, right? Often we have people who need and want a co-op, but don't necessarily have equity for various reasons, mostly because workers are so exploited and marginalized. They don't always have savings or something, right? In the working co-op world, right, we can take it out of their earnings. Their equity can be paid in installments, and so that helps a lot. But in general, if you think about it, cooperatives are supposed to help people who have assets to do something more with their assets. But yet, in the Black history, I actually found that co-ops and cooperation were used for people who had almost nothing. They were able to pool meager amounts together to make up something that then everybody could benefit from. And so we need to, again, focus on those aspects of cooperation, right? Not just the standard traditional way to understand it. Also, I think what's getting in the way is the siloing, right, of co-ops, the fact that, you know, worker co-ops are not really supported by ag co-ops and consumer co-ops. And in fact, in consumer co-ops, workers are still treated pretty badly. And often workers are BIPOC people, right? So they already are being treated badly, even if they work in a co-op, right? That's not a worker co-op. So there's those kinds of tensions about how co-ops are seen and whether they're actually shown to help people in different classes, let alone different races or ethnic groups. So there's that kind of issue about the siloing. Urban versus rural. I don't know if you have it as much in Canada, but in the US, there's a huge siloing. A lot of co-op information, co-op perspective is from the rural perspective. We just recently have moved into focusing more on urban co-ops. And of course, BIPOC, some BIPOC people are more urban than rural. And so we lose them if we're only focused on the rural. And then finally, co-op education tends to be internal, right? Only to the people who are already in the co-op, but really we need to be doing co-op education for everybody, right? So that all people from young age understand what co-ops can and should do for society and how to be in a co-op, so that they already have that exposure, so that then outreach to a variety of groups and making a variety of people feel comfortable in a co-op isn't such a far reach because they already know about it. But if we're only really educating people who already know about it and have joined a co-op, then we're missing an opportunity to really be more proactive, to have to outreach to more communities. So we need to make sure to get the information out to more and varied communities, and maybe more universal co-op education in general would help with that. So next slide. So solutions. So create solidarity systems. So if we use principles 6, 7, and 8, right? If we create more multi-stakeholder co-ops, right? So more co-ops where workers have more of a say, right? More co-ops that have a sense of solidarity and work with their communities, that connect with other co-ops, right? And do more of this public education. That will go a long way, right? Because people need to know about the options, need to feel welcomed, and to be empowered by the information, right? But again, the information has to include these histories, right? This acknowledgement of the past normalization that we've used in the co-op movement, and bringing in the histories of all the BIPOC people who have been involved in co-ops and can be examples and inspirations and stuff for people. We need to be proactive, right? We need to really come to terms with our privileges and our invisible assumptions and the systemic racism and racist practices that are even in co-ops. We need to acknowledge it, talk about, train people how to be anti-oppressive, how to, how to be more welcoming, how to change that diversity and inclusion into real racial equity, right? We need to acknowledge that we need to move toward that, and acknowledge that we need to learn more and train ourselves more about that. And that's the better learning and training, and then better outreach and communications. Next slide. One of the things I found in my history of African American co-ops was how important community and organizations are. And one of the things I also been starting to tell more white co-op groups is you've got to reach out to other Black communities, Black organizations, BIPOC, sorry, it's not just Black. So I'm on the next slide. Community and organizations matter. Thank you. So that's where, right, it turns out most of the Black co-ops that I found thrived at a time when there were Black organizations that were doing co-op development and co-op education, where there was more organizing around co-op and development and co-ops, and then there were more connection to communities and community involvement. And communities often were the ones that kept and protected co-ops. And so I'm suggesting that the co-op movement needs to connect more with Black organizations, Black communities, BIPOC, sorry, organizations and communities. And then I just have 3, do I have time for 3 examples, or should I stop here?
Jessica, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So next slide. So I have one example from the US past. Actually, I just have 2 examples, I think. One example from the US past, and, more solutions, sorry. And then, right, we just need to update our materials, right? I think I said that already. We need to rethink and rewrite our development strategies, right, that address and include more BIPOC issues. And we need to diversify the power relations and decision-making inside co-ops and co-op federations, right? That's where, a real attention to diversity in the power structures is important. Next slide. So I did want to quickly just mention 2 examples of activities that I think made a real difference, one in history and one what I've seen in Canada. And I'm sure there's more examples in Canada, but let me just talk about North Carolina in the 1930s and 40s. 2 Black independent schools in the mid 30s during the Great Depression started teaching cooperative economics, especially to the parents of the children that went to their schools, and started helping parents to form agricultural co-ops and credit unions and things like that. They realized they were like 30 miles away from each other, and they realized that they were doing similar things, so they started an Eastern North Carolina coalition of Black co-ops. And then that coalition formed a statewide federation that was eventually called the North Carolina Council of Cooperatives and Credit Unions. And what they decided to do was they thought one of the barriers, which is what I keep talking about, was that there wasn't enough materials geared toward Black communities about how to develop co-ops and credit unions. And so they actually met together for like a year and developed these manuals and workshops. They got the state of North Carolina, the agricultural department, to actually support them and then to pay for them to distribute the manuals and to go out and do workshops. And so they, you know, the manuals were finished by about 1945. Within what, 5 years between 1948 and between 1945 and 1948, so within about 3 years, they had a huge success. There had been about 3 Black credit unions and a few Black co-ops in the 30s. By 1948, there were 98 Black credit unions in the state of North Carolina, just in one state, partly because of this program that they were able to do. So that, you know, they pooled together their resources, they created specific Black resources, but then they got the state apparatus to provide the financing and the resources to get the word out, to get the materials out, and to get the workshops done. They also, in addition to the 98 credit unions that get created during this period, 48 other Black co-ops get created during that period. Consumer stores, health associations, a housing project. So you can see how important that, right, leveraging Blacks, taking things into their own hands, but then leveraging it to get the wider community support. Next slide. And so then the last example I want to do is 2 credit unions in Canada that I want to mention. You know, Lou Hammond Kettleson and I have studied Affinity Credit Union for about 4 or 5 years, a couple of years ago. And one of the things we were looking at was how they were handling the mergers, right? Because I think you all know that credit unions have been either forced to or been merging all over the North America. And so what does that mean for the sort of local control, the localness of the original credit unions and how they connected to their communities? Because some of the credit unions that Affinity merged with had been actually First Nations credit unions. And so we were wondering how, right, so what happened to the sense of ownership and local control in those credit unions? And we found out that Affinity actually created what they call district councils, a district council structure, so that there could remain some level of local governance in each of the branches, or at least in each of the districts, right, that they had. And what those local, what the local governance does is there were certain things about loans and donations that these local members who are elected to the district councils could decide on. And they also would all have a pot of money to do donations to their communities. And so this was a way for the credit union, even though it was now a huge statewide system, to keep some level of local control, local distinctiveness, and support for local communities. So that was an interesting governance structure that they did to be much more than just inclusive, because this is about distributing money, right, loans and community funds. And then Assiniboine also did something interesting with governance to make sure the diversity was better on their board. Every time they had a board seat available, instead of just, you know, looking for volunteers to run for the board, they would do a SWOT analysis of the expertise and representation that they had on the board. So if they didn't have enough women, if they didn't have enough BIPOC people, if they didn't have enough whatever other expertise they were looking for, they would do a careful analysis, and then they would strategically ask people or nominate people to the board to fit the slots and the gaps that they had, so that they always would have a board that would have the diversity that they needed or that they felt they needed. So that's another kind of deliberate governance side of things that you can do. And so next slide, I think I'm now finished. Yes, so I just want to end with this notion, right, that on the one hand, we cannot achieve social, political, or racial justice without economic democracy and economic justice, right? We need economic democracy to really achieve those. But we also can't achieve economic democracy if we don't have racial equity. And so even though, you know, I've been pushing hard for that we need economic transformation, economic democracy, economic justice, but I can't push it. I can only push it just so hard if those of us who are already practicing economic democracy aren't practicing anti-racism and not creating racial equity. And so I'm hoping, you know, that's partly why you invited me, because you're ready and want to make sure you're promoting achieving racial equity. And that will just strengthen your co-ops, strengthen the economic democracy that you guys are practicing. Next slide. Thank you.